Welcome and thank you all for being here. What I'm going to do is talk about Constable's drawings, obviously, but I'm going to do it more or less chronologically. So I'll start with his early drawings and move through to his wonderful late works. And Constable's a wonderful artist to talk about in terms of drawing because it was central, drawing was central to both his art and also his personal life in a way as well. It was central to all aspects of his life. He drew throughout his career from the very beginning all through. There was never a period when he wasn't drawing. He very often dated his drawings precisely, so you can almost check what he was doing and read them as a kind of visual diary. He drew for different purposes. He drew to record landscapes, details of the natural world, details of the agricultural work, which was absolutely the heart of his compositions. He drew as part of working out, composing when he was working on a painting. He drew for his own pleasure. I'll show you some watercolours later on in the talk that are made with a kind of holiday spirit. He drew to commemorate special dates, special places, and he also drew imaginatively. When I first started working on Constable when I was at V&A, I thought of him as a very sort of visual, an artist who was always looking at the world around him and trying to capture what was there. And that's definitely true, he did that. But certainly later on, he began to look more inwards and his vision became more inwards. So those are the drawings that we'll be heading for in the course of the afternoon. He drew in many different ways. He made tiny sketchbook drawings, and he also made very large, full-scale works of art in their own right to be exhibited on the walls of the Royal Academy. He didn't use a massively wide range of media, perhaps, but he pushed those media to the absolute limits, whether he was using graphite or chalks. He would really explore the potential of those media. And another thing that sets him apart, I think, and why we're still talking about him today, is that his art was very dynamic. He never fell into a formulaic way of working, which quite a lot of artists of his own time did, and I think that helped them to become very commercially successful, which Constable really wasn't until later in his career, if at all really. But he was always looking for new ways of representing the landscape, of dealing with a problem. He would rethink it every single time and come to a problem with a different solution, and that was often to do with drawing. So drawing was essentially what kept him connected to the world. So start with his early drawings. Takes a bit of time for Constable to find his feet, in a way. He's not one of those draftsmen who just immediately kind of, becomes absolutely brilliant. His early drawings are quite hesitant. There's a kind of anxiety about them. He's obviously looking at other artists and trying to work out what he wants to do, what kind of artist he wants to be. But first, a little bit of biographical background, because these are his parents, portraits by himself, Anne and Golding Constable. Constable grew up in East Bergholt, which is a small, rather prosperous, it was prosperous then, it's prosperous now, village in southern Suffolk near the Essex border. His father, Golding, was a really successful businessman. He inherited money, but he made a lot more money. He was a miller. He owned 2 watermills and a windmill and some acres of land, really in the centre of East Bergholt, radiating out from there. But this is crucial, he also owned a transport business. He owned barges that would take the flour that he would mill in his own mills from his own land, but also other farmers' grain, and he would have it shipped to London on his own, in his own vessel, to be sold. So this is the really crucial thing. There's a lot of money in the background, but there's also land management going on. That's absolutely key to Constable's career. So this is the situation he grew up in, and this is the house that Golding actually built in the centre of East Bergholt. So this is in the mid-1770s, very substantial, absolutely beautiful, up to the minute house. And he called it East Bergholt House. So it was very much, the constables have arrived in East Bergholt. And Constable has this funny sort of in-between period, because he's just as he's quite late to get going with his drawing, he's sort of, the beginning of his art training is quite belated as well. There's a funny period in his life of about 6.5 years between him leaving school at 16 in 1792 and him going to the Royal Academy to train to be an artist in 1799. So, and that's because he has an older brother also called Golding, who has a learning disability and isn't able to take over the family business. He's also got a younger brother called Abram, but Abram's only a little boy when Constable leaves school. So there's this anxious time while they're waiting. He is waiting for Abram to become 16 years old so he can say yes or no. But in those middle years, Constable is having to train to be not an artist but a miller. So he puts on his white coat and hat, he goes to work in the windmill. He later says it was only a year, but actually I think, looking at Golding, I suspect that his father got him to do quite a bit more work in those years when Constable was living at home in East Bergholt. He was drawing, but I think that he was also working on the land for his father, which all goes to, it's taken back into his work in later years. So let's start before 1799 and look at the kinds of drawings, the sort of juvenilia, the kinds of drawings he's making at that point. So he's very interested in East Bergholt itself. East Bergholt is this incredibly important place in his life. And he draws the houses and cottages and the lanes around there. And I think this focus is partly because he has this really important meeting in 1796 when he's 20 with an artist called J.T. Smith, or Antiquity Smith. This is a man who's about 10 years older than Constable. He's a drawing master, and he's publishing this book, this collection of prints called Antiquities of London at the time. But at the time Constable meets him, he's collecting material for a book of rural subjects, so cottages. So he quite clearly gets Constable drawing little cottage scenes. It just feels as though Constable is quite hesitant at this point. He's trying to work out how to do it. These aren't the works of a professional artist yet. This is very much an amateur artist's work. I think what he's doing is he's looking at etchings of this kind. This is Smith's remarks on rural scenery of 1797. So this was before, this was kind of postdates Constable's drawings, but this is exactly the kind of thing he was looking at and trying to emulate, almost trying to emulate a kind of etching style. So he's looking at other works and trying to work out what to do. Not that Smith actually used any of his drawings, any of Constable's drawings, which is rather mean of him in his book, but Constable makes these and rather anxiously sends them to him. But Smith also urges Constable to research Gainsborough, and this really enthused Constable. I think what Smith is doing is he's acting. I think he's quite a charismatic figure, and he's acting as a kind of living, breathing example of a professional artist and showing Constable that it is possible. So this is a bit of a turning point in Constable's life. But he says, I think what you should do is go to Ipswich, which isn't too far from East Bergholt, go and look at, try to find out all you can about Gainsborough. And I think quite clearly at this point Constable has seen some maybe drawings by Gainsborough. I think a drawing a watercolour like this at the edge of a wood by Constable is, I think he's been looking at drawings like this, Gainsborough on the right. It's partly the cross-hatching which he's emulating, but partly I think it's just the mood. There's a very gentle lyrical mood to this watercolour. So I think he's finding out what he can of different artists, and he's making his own drawings in similar styles. But a big change came in 1799. This is when Abraham, the younger brother, says, yes, I will become the miller. And so Constable goes to London and he enrolls at the Royal Academy schools and begins to work in the life class. So the first time he's drawing in a very dedicated, very concerted, very supervised way. With drawings, and actually he continued to attend the life class for a long time, for many years. I think it was partly a social centre, but it was partly just to keep drawing figures. I think particularly for a landscape painter it was important for him to carry on doing this. East Bergholt though continued to be of exceptional importance for Constable. Throughout his life really, but certainly from 1799, which is the point he goes to London, until 1816, when he's 40, when he finally marries, the pattern of his life, not every year, but basically his default position is that he leaves London probably early July and spends the whole of the summer and most of the autumn in East Bergholt, staying in the family home, so being absorbed back into the family, and then he'll wait until late October, early November to go back to London. And it's during these months, these weeks and months, that he spends a lot of time sketching and drawing, oil sketching, drawing in a sketchbook, and really digging deeper and deeper into this small area of Suffolk, and it just maintains and creates this emotional attachment which drives his art for the rest of his life. But this is an interesting drawing because he made it about 1800, so he's a student by this point. But a good friend of his from back home called Lucy Hurlock is getting married. So as a wedding present, Constable thinks, I know what, if anyone is leaving East Bergholt, what they must surely want is a reminder of what it looks like. So he makes these wonderful panoramic drawings, these watercolours. These are just two of them, of the whole of the Store Valley, so from East Bergholt looking towards Dedham and beyond, which is such a wonderful idea. I think it probably tells you a bit more about Constable than it does about Lucy Hurlock. I think it's probably what he would have wanted, what he wanted for himself. But again, I think there's something rather odd about these drawings in that they look a bit old-fashioned for the time. This was a time when watercolour had really become this very dynamic medium and was being used very expressively. And here's Constable almost making something that's a bit more like a tinted drawing, like this example by Sandby. But I don't think it was so much that he was just making a naive drawing. I think what he was doing was finding a style that he thought was just right for the subject. He wanted to make a portrait of every tree, every hedgerow, because that was the important thing to give to Lucy. Now, he very, very rarely went on sketching tours, hardly ever, but he made an exception in 1801 when he went to the Peak District in Derbyshire. Now this was very strange because most artists of his generation spent their summers going off and travelling around and filling their sketchbooks with compositions that they then look through and turn into oil paintings. But with Constable it was mostly East Bergholt. But he, as I say, he made an exception for Derbyshire. I just have a feeling, though, that when you compare a drawing like that to his Suffolk drawings, they look oddly unfocused. And if I found one of these in a junk shop, I might probably buy it, but I wouldn't think it was by Constable. There's so little to tell you that it is. I mean, the tree on the right could be any old tree. The trees in the panoramic drawings are very specific trees. So it's funny, it's almost as though I think what he loves is a landscape where there's a lot going on, where there's agricultural work going on specifically. And I think Derbyshire just didn't quite engage him until he came to a quarry for millstones. I think millstones really, he must have thought, wow, this is at last something interesting. I think that's a rather telling drawing. Then 5 years later, he went to the Lake District and made a lot of drawings. And there's a much more of a sense when he's in the lakes that he gets much more engaged with what he's doing. I have to admit that I found the watercolours he made there quite difficult to sort of understand for a long time, because I just thought that they looked a bit sort of unfocused. And there's been a lot of debate over time about how Constable felt about the lakes. And I think his biographer said, or Constable once said, that the lakes oppressed his spirits and he didn't like it. So, but I think actually that what he was doing, as ever, was using the media, using watercolour to try to represent what he was seeing in front of him, which was a very misty landscape, a kind of diffused, kind of cloudy light, which you see in the top one of Borrowdale. And I think this drawing of Thirlmere is incredibly detailed and beautiful. So he's sort of finding out, he's cautiously travelling, but he doesn't really do it again. That's it. For the rest of the time when he travels, it's just to see friends, to see family. Let's look at some of Constable's sketchbooks. Constable seems rarely to have gone anywhere without a sketchbook in his pocket, and what he described as a close and continual observance of nature was absolutely central to his working life. These are pages from a sketchbook he kept over the summer, July to October of 1813. And the sketchbook is tiny. It's little bigger than the size of a playing card. It's really small. But you can see how he's tessellated so many details onto these pages. So cows, down here you've got a couple of figures in outline, a bit of post. Practically no one but Constable would bother drawing a post, but he did. Cottage across a river. I love particularly this man with a scythe here and the two supervisors looking on. But this really intense use of the materials. Another one, my particular favourite here, is when he's turned the sketchbook on its side and he's made this wonderful drawing of sheep sheltering under the shade of a spreading tree here. So these are the sketchbooks that he would use, come back to many years later. An example of that is this little study of timber posts, still from that 1813 sketchbook, and then on the right, the leaping horse, 1825. Here is exactly the same bit of post. Constable would never invent anything like that. It was, even posts were too important to invent. But as ever, he changed. He didn't always do the same thing. And the sketchbook he used the following summer of 1814, when he was back in East Bergholt again, it's qualitatively different. It's, if anything, even smaller than the 1813 sketchbook. But he's making much larger views. I think he's thinking more in terms of entire compositions than the little scraps. Well, I'm using his own word. He described what I'd just shown you before as little scraps that he'd picked up. And it's almost as though here he's thinking much more about how can I make a composition. He'd actually got into a bit of trouble earlier this year because he tried to scale up a really tiny drawing from his earlier sketchbook to make a large composition, and he'd had endless trouble with it. He needed to add some ploughmen because there wasn't enough going on, and it would look too cold. So he was thinking, how can I solve this problem? And this is when he began to work, to find compositions out of doors. This is a page from the same sketchbook where his father's having a barge made in a dry dock, in his own dry dock. And for Constable, it's absolutely irresistible. So he makes this drawing in his sketchbook on the 7th of September 1814, and then he sets up his easel next to the dry dock, and he makes this painting now in the V&A, which is so close to the sketchbook drawing. He's thinned out the personnel. There aren't quite so many figures. There are more workers around here, but so he's simplified the scene a bit, but the main part of it is absolutely there. There are also lots of larger scale drawings he made in these years, when he had a brief stint of getting very keen on working in watercolour about this time, about 1805, just the year before he goes to the Lake District and works quite intensively in watercolour. So here he's clearly thinking about, not so much about the details, as about the atmosphere and the light that you could see at sunrise and at sunset. And the church was a place, the church in East Bergholt, very near to the family home. That was a place that he returned to again and again, just from all sorts of different angles. It was quite unusual for him to use black and white chalk on buff paper. Much more usual to use graphite. But I think he used it in this instance because he wanted to capture a scene as it was becoming dusk, and as there were lights on inside the church through the windows, and he wanted to capture with white chalk that particular glow and the quality of light, so the very shady trees in front. And this is a really spectacular drawing he made in the summer of 1814, which is a view from the window of his family home, looking east, looking from the back of the house. I think it could be about saying goodbye to this particular garden, because his mother is about to make flower gardens in this shrubbery area at the front. So it's almost as though he's sort of recording it as it looks. But this is very much a kind of, I was about to say it's like a portrait, but it's more like an inventory of the Constable family's possessions, in a way, their land, because these are the gardens, this is the family's threshing barn, these are Constable acres at the back, leading out from East Bergholt, acres and acres, towards the heath where there's Constable's father's windmill here. And this is the rectory where the rector lives, who's the grandfather of Maria Bicknell, who is the woman Constable loves. He's loved since 1809, but the rector is putting every difficulty he can in the way of the two of them getting married. But so in a way, it sort of tells Constable's life story, this drawing, in intense detail. And that sort of leads on quite well, in a way, to a group of drawings Constable made in Suffolk in 1817, because he finally marries Maria Bicknell in the October of 1816, and at this point the whole pattern of his life changes. So he's based in London full-time for the first time. So he kind of has to find a way of saying goodbye to East Bergholt. But what they do is the couple go and have this final swan song, this long holiday in East Bergholt for weeks and weeks and weeks on end over the summer and early autumn of 1817. And it's sort of the beginning of something and the end of something, because it signals this great sort of cut-off point. But also Maria is pregnant, so they know that it's the first summer they spend together as a married couple, but it's also the last, all being well, they'll spend together without children arriving. So it's this really precious time, and an overlapping of the place and the person he loves the most. So the drawings he makes at that time have this valedictory, this really intense quality. This is I think the first drawing he made in that visit. You see, he's actually chosen a very soft pencil to use, which kind of sort of suppresses detail. And what it is, it shows a view from a lane which leads down from East Bergholt, where the family lived, down to Flatford, where his father's mill is. But it's a particular point when another lane that goes through that gate there on the right veers off and goes towards Dedham. And that's the route that Constable took when he was a boy and going to school. And then when he was 16, he stopped going down that way and went down the other way instead. So it's this for him, it was a very emotionally significant place. When I first saw this drawing, I sort of almost wanted to look round the trees and over them. I thought, why is there's this amazing view over Dedham Vale? Why has he obscured it almost completely with trees? Well, I think it's just because it's not really about the view, it's more about his feeling about the place. It's much more emotional than that. And on the back of the drawing, he's written lines of Latin verse. In translation, they say, "This spot saw the day spring of my life, hours of joy and years of happiness. This place first tinged my boyish fancy with a love of the art. This place was the origin of my fame." So he's kind of supercharging his drawing with layers of history and poetry and also Christian faith, which was very important to him and is kind of slightly submerged in a lot of his work. And he also made a really amazing group of drawings of the church at this time as well, with really immense detail. He revelled in the architecture. He sort of looked at every flint, every brick with enormous kind of degree of attentiveness and a real sense of occasion with these drawings. They're very composed, quite unlike the other drawings of the church where you get a view of this and a view of that. This is much more formal in a way. It's almost like a tribute, this virtuosic draftsmanship as a parting gift to the church in the village. And finally, quite a lot of these drawings, and some of which are quite mysterious, not exactly sure why he chose particular spots, but they all seem imbued with significance. But finally, in late October, he makes this magnificent drawing of elm trees in the park of Old Hall, which is the big house in the centre of East Bergholt. And it's on a much larger scale. It's a really big exhibition drawing. He exhibited at the Royal Academy this drawing the following summer. So it was an exhibition piece, and he used different grades of graphite. So he used a very silvery graphite for the leaves, a darker grade, a darker, softer graphite for the trunks. But it's an amazingly sustained feat of observation. It's almost as though he's traced every single branch, almost every leaf. I've really never seen any drawing quite like that. It sort of rings with a sense of place. It's as though he's really honouring these trees, bottling the atmosphere. So all these drawings, there's a kind of ritualistic dimension to these drawings. Now, other places became important too over time. Salisbury was one of them. As I said, Constable really never travelled, or rarely travelled, for the sake of it. It was really just to see people. He happened to have two great friends who were connected with Salisbury. An early friend and very important mentor was the Bishop of Salisbury, called John Fisher, and also John Fisher's nephew, also John Fisher. Almost everyone in Constable's personal life is called John, which makes it everything a bit difficult. But the upshot is that he goes to stay in Salisbury fairly often, and he draws the cathedral. This is from his very first trip, in the way that he draws St Mary's in East Bergholt. He sort of stalks it and draws it from every angle, and again using chalks and this buff paper, which he seemed to have thought most suitable. And you can see actually, if you look at this Salisbury Cathedral from the Bishop's grounds and go back to this, he's obviously looking back over his drawings when he comes to work on a composition like this. So his drawings often have this quite long gestation, and that's certainly true of Stonehenge. This is a wonderful graphite study, but just a sketchbook study of Stonehenge that he makes on one of his visits to John Fisher the Younger in 1820. and so it must be evening, the long shadows, various figures sitting around. But he puts it away for about 15 years, and then at a certain point, 1835, he comes back to it and he realises that he could make it into a composition. So he first makes a sort of sketch here, and then he thinks, well, no, maybe it could be a bit more dramatic. So he does it again. You see it's squared for transfer, so he can scale it up in size. And what you get in the end is this really magnificent watercolour that's grown from that sketchbook drawing, which is very close. It's very close to what he comes up with. But what he's done is he's had to extend the sheet. It still wasn't quite big enough. It's sort of bursting its bounds. So he's added extra strips to the top and the bottom, just in order to give it the magnitude he felt it should have. And one last thing he added as well, this hair, which is scarpering along at the bottom here, is actually on a separate piece of paper and pasted on. So it must have been a kind of afterthought that he thought, well, I'll add that. Then Hampstead also it almost took over from East Bergholt as the place that he returned to again and again. Especially after his marriage. Maria had tuberculosis, or what we now know to be tuberculosis. So she needed cleaner air, especially in summer, than was available in central London. So from 1819, for most summers until 1827, the family, when they actually got a permanent place in Hampstead, the family would find lodgings there most summers. And of course the heath was there, which was the closest thing to Suffolk, in that it afforded these great views over sweeping valleys and wonderful trees. But it lacked an agricultural dimension, the dimension that Constable really engaged him. So he had to find something else to fill that gap. And what he really focuses on, apart from the skies, which we'll come to in a moment, is the trees. But he does it in ways that you don't necessarily expect, because we've seen him do the magnificent elm tree drawing. This is such an experimental drawing in comparison. This drawing of elm trees in graphite, very soft graphite. It's obvious that what he's really interested in here is the way the light shines through the foliage. So it's a drawing of that, really. It's a drawing where he's not really particularly interested in individual leaves here. He's interested in showing the masses and the way in which the light really glows through areas, gaps in the leaves. So again, he's not being formulaic. He's working out a new way of drawing to meet a particular case, to do what he really, to explore what he wants to explore. And he does it again in a very odd way, this very curious drawing, very oddly framed, of trees and wattle hurdles. I think what he's interested in really are the textures and the patterns that he can find there. But it's such a sort of odd thing to choose, but there's something quite experimental, something quite abstract about these drawings. But then you see him 10 years later making this drawing, and it's almost self-consciously old mastery, as though he's been looking at Rubens, someone like that, and he's doing a drawing which is very much more of a conventional old master drawing. So he's never doing the same thing. He's always changing and adapting his style. And he also invested emotion in the landscape at Hampstead in just the way that he did in East Bergholt. And this really magnificent, again very large scale drawing of fir trees he made on the 2nd of October of 1820, which, as he points out in a little inscription, the top right hand corner, was, well, what he calls his wedding day. He means his wedding anniversary. It's 4 years after his marriage to Maria. So he makes this wonderful drawing to commemorate, to celebrate that, but brings, it sort of inscribes it on the landscape of Hampstead. The famous sky studies that Constable makes are almost all oil sketches, and he makes those from 1820 to 1821. But he started to use watercolour again round about 1830, and began to use it in quite a concerted way. At this point, he was in quite poor health, so he couldn't roam on the heath in the way that he did when he was making that really concerted study of skies 10 years before. But he starts to make drawings from his window and making drawings in pencil and in watercolour. And this is a really wonderful example of one of those. He's inscribed it on the back, about 11 to noon, September the 15th, 1830, wind west. So you get exactly the time, the date, the weather conditions that were happening at that time. And wonderful, all different, just the ways in which the rain is sweeping down from these clouds here, but just such interest in what's going on, the colours, the textures. Another interesting thing is it's clearly on laid paper, writing paper rather than drawing paper, almost as though he was about to write a letter but then spotted something more interesting going on outside the window, so did that instead. Here's another really lovely example. This was made one December day, and again his attention must have been caught by the weather that was going on outside, because we know that he made this drawing about 3 o'clock in the afternoon because he writes that on the back. But this is from his windows in Hampstead looking towards London. You can just make out St Paul's, the dome of St Paul's in the centre, although it's slightly dissolving in this very misty, rainy atmosphere. But what I particularly love about this watercolour is that it's got drops here and there on it, here in particular, of water. Now that could have been Constable being experimental, making it into a very watery image, but it could also have been that he opened the window and simply allowed the rain to come in, or the rain just came in anyway and added its own fingerprints to the picture. Now, brief digression into working landscapes, because the working landscapes were at the heart of what Constable did, at the heart of his great 6-foot compositions, and the nuts and the bolts of that are found in his sketchbooks, and even in this wonderful watercolour for windmill at Stoke. He really knew about windmills because he used to work in one, and he's even got the miller here in his traditional white coat coming out of the windmill. His brother Abraham said, "When I look at a windmill by John, I know it will go round," which is not the case with a lot of other artists. So there's that kind of technical detail that you know is just, it's underpinning, and a lot of that comes from the drawing, from the observation. I'm always interested in just how fascinated Constable is with ploughs, for instance. So we've got the oil sketch on the left here of 2 different kinds of plough that were used in Suffolk. But then fairly late in life, in the 1830s, he's actually making drawings of ploughs that he saw in different parts of the country because they were so interesting to him. So he does this drawing top right of a plough used in Epsom, bottom below right a plough used at Bewdley in Worcestershire. So you get this idea of someone who's just passionately interested in agricultural equipment, and if he sees something curious, he wants to make a study of it. Brighton was another place Constable spent quite a lot of time, against his will really. He was there because it was, again, a place that was good for his wife's health, and he complained bitterly about having to go there. But you can almost trace in his sketchbooks how he gets more and more interested in the detail. So here he is in a sketchbook just drawing fishing equipment, getting really close in to draw nets and anchors and various other bits of equipment. On the right there, the fishermen fishing with nets. So other artists are painting more picturesque sailing boats, and here's Constable really focusing right in and making these drawings. And again, there's another Brighton scene, more reportage in this case. This is a beached schooner So a lot of drama going along around it as it's being propped up, and a brig coming in on the right and having its cargoes unloaded. So he's interested in it was a kind of substitute for an agricultural scene, I think. It was anything with a large bit of kit or equipment and a lot of activity. He's always drawn to that. I just want to end by looking at some of the late drawings and watercolours. One thing you notice when you look at Constable's drawings and paintings, and this is something that the wonderful exhibition at the Royal Academy, Late Constable, really brought out, is that the emotional temperature of his work rises. You can feel it rise over time. There's fewer nuts and bolts, and there's more memory and imagination, and the drawings become more reflective. This is what I think is a really lovely drawing he made in Suffolk in the autumn of 1827, when he goes to Suffolk for quite a long stay without Maria, but with his two eldest children, because he wants to show them something of the childhood he has. And while he kept an eye on them, I think that's the two of them fishing from a moored barge there. He's making drawings, but making drawings with a very loose hand, and they have a drawing like this has a real holiday air about it. It's loose, it's not made for, it's not going to turn into a composition. It's made for pleasure and to record this time, this very precious time with his children. And watercolours as well. Watercolour came to the fore round about 1830, partly because it was much easier for him to use than oil paints. He was in quite poor health, and he found the whole business of painting in oil increasingly difficult, so he paints more in watercolour. But a landscape like this is interesting because earlier on, when he wants to use colour, he paints with oils, but watercolour gives such a different atmosphere. So he's exploring a different feeling, different colours with watercolour. And he makes quite a lot of watercolours as well of the landscape of Sussex, because he goes to visit a friend who lives there, and he is absolutely astounded at how beautiful the Sussex landscape is around Arundel. And this is partly because Constable has hardly been anywhere. He goes to so few places. He goes to Hampstead, he goes to Brighton, he goes to Salisbury. He went up to Leicestershire to stay with a friend of his, but you can barely get him out of the house because the house is full of old master paintings, and that's what he's really interested in. So he doesn't have a broad experience of different landscapes. So he's totally entranced when he goes to Sussex. And again, a watercolour like this was just made entirely for pleasure. But you can see him being quite experimental. He's using very opaque watercolour, using it very vigorously, scratching out here to give these highlights that he was always so interested in including. You just get the feeling of him taking great pleasure in using watercolour. He's obviously turned his brush around, used the wooden end to just make highlights in the roof here, just before it dried. Again, just another very, very expressive, very free watercolour, just made for his own pleasure. And then finally, there are these extraordinary drawings, monochrome drawings, that he made in the 1830s. This is one that he drew on the back of a letter that he was writing to one of his sisters. So he turned it over at one point and made this very inky blot of a landscape and a wild storm. It's very difficult to date these because we can guess that this one was made around about December 1831 because the letter is dated that. But with the other sort of blot landscapes he makes in inks, he doesn't date, and this is partly because they're all about memory. They're not him going to a place and making a drawing. They're about him remembering and reflecting and almost finding a way of drawing landscapes that haunted him, that had haunted him for all his career. And these tended to be Suffolk landscapes. This is a view on the store. This is really magnificent drawing of another view on the store with Dedham Church Tower recognisably. And again, these are made on laid paper, so presumably writing paper rather than drawing paper. So you get the sense that this was Constable at home. He'd seen by this point this whole project of a lot of his sketches and paintings were being translated into mezzotint, into tonal print, which made him think very deeply about the balance of light and dark in pictures. So that could have been one of the catalysts for making these. But I think I wanted to end with these because I think it's when you see, again, Constable working in a different way. He's looking at what drawing can offer in terms of being a richly expressive medium, a medium that has great capacity for creative latitude, in which he can explore ideas and emotions that are sort of outside the business of art. Okay, well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to try to answer them at least. Thank you. Yes.
Thinking of Constable's work, it seemed to me that from all his daily drawings, he got the ability to work very much more emotionally, which is, you know, you look at something like this, you're almost looking at something a little bit apocalyptic. And the emotional aspect seems to me, and what you, if you would agree, to actually place, this is why he was popular abroad, as I understand he was. Whereas the English tended to want, well, if it's bricks, it's got to look like bricks. I don't know where this fits in with, obviously you have a lot more knowledge than myself.
I think that's a really good point. Did everyone hear the?
Enough, yes.
No, I think you did. I think everyone heard. I think that's very true, and I think it is that sense of the experimentation and the constantly finding new ways, which I think was sort of baffling, whether it was, well, what we were looking at before of him making the sparkling lights in a watercolour, and when he did that with oil paint, critics called it Constable's Snow. But when his works were shown in Paris, then this was seen as being just a wonderful way of representing what the natural world actually looked like under English skies and in sunlight. So yes, there was, because he was much too experimental and yes, emotional as well, I think, to really be understood.
Yes, he loved the countryside, didn't he?
He did, and East Bergholt, it's interesting that he keeps coming back to it, and in these very late drawings he's still coming back to it, but not necessarily going there in reality, but he's visiting it in his mind. So all the drawings he makes, he's also making a great, enormous sort of mental database of images that are all there. And this is what he comes back to late on in these late reflective years. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, hello.
Yeah, fantastic talk, thank you. So you mentioned with these later drawings that one of them was on the back of a letter. I was just wondering about the others, whether they were also sent as parts of letters, or whether he made them just for himself, or whether he intended to exhibit them.
These late sort of wash drawings.
Yeah.
I think they were made just for himself. These late drawings. Now you ask that about letters, I don't think there's anything on the back of these two V&A drawings. but I would like to go back and just double check that. But it's just that he does seem to be using writing paper, laid paper.
Was there, maybe I misunderstood, was there one, the first one?
Yes,
you showed,
yes,
was
yes.
that on
The
letter?
Princeton
Yeah.
drawing was he started the letter, then he turned it over and
Oh, I
drew.
see, so it wasn't like
drew back.
he was explaining something with the image that.
No, seemingly not. No, I think just a letter to his
Okay.
sister, and then turned it over and drew a rather apocalyptic landscape. But yes, it's interesting. Are these landscapes apocalyptic? I mean, this one certainly looks very. It's so there's such a lot of energy going on. But the others, I don't know, just look. They look to me more sort of calm, more reflective, almost. There's a kind of joyfulness about them, or certainly a sense of sort of re-meeting landscapes that have been just haunted his mind from his whole career. But what I love is just that distance he's come from those really, really sort of detailed little sketches that tessellated into tiny pages of sketchbooks to something totally different via all kinds of various and different techniques and just answers to problems. He's always trying to solve something, or to represent something that hasn't really been represented before. That's what he's trying to do. Sometimes he'll be detailed, and sometimes the detail doesn't matter. But it's just this restless a quest to represent the world as it looked, but also as it felt emotionally as well, I think. Yes.
What size are these ink drawings?
They're relatively small, kind of
Huge,
letter. Well, that's the trouble. I think actually the next time I give a lecture, I'm going to have to sort of reduce them, but you can't,
No,
or just
see,
give them.
I just
Yeah.
wondered.
But yes, they are sort of fairly small, domestic scale. Whereas in, for example, the 1817 elm trees is a really, really large scale exhibitable drawing.
That would be fabulous, large.
Well, it would be amazing, yeah. To post it.
Did you sell his watercolours and drawings during his lifetime, or were they kept private?
Mostly kept private, actually. But mind you, he didn't manage to sell many of his oil paintings either, so they were very often. His father had a word for it, which was lumber. And that very, very often his works they would be exhibited at the Royal Academy one year, perhaps the British Institution the following year, and they would very often come back to him. But most of the drawings and watercolours, not all of them, but most of them were made entirely for his own purposes. And that's partly why so many of them are in the Victoria and Albert Museum now, because in 1888 his daughter Isabel made a series of magnificent gifts and bequests, but it included gifting to the V&A essentially his studio contents, so sketchbooks and an enormous number of drawings and watercolours and oil sketches that happened to be in his studio that were just part of his stock in trade as a working artist. So that's when the V&A became the sort of the primary study centre. There are other places, like the Tate with more finished paintings. The V&A has some, but it's there that you can go and really look through them. So everyone should go to the V&A, go to the print room. You can just, I don't know if you have to make an appointment now, I think you probably do, but it's really worth doing, just to go and have that opportunity of just looking through a few boxes of the drawings and watercolours, because there's just nothing, apart from getting the scale, there's just nothing like having that encounter with them. Yeah.
I think on that, one more. Sorry, I was just going to ask, it seemed like his style and his mediums were always evolving. Does that speak to that they're never quite finding the perfect way he wants to express himself, or maybe he had just many ways he'd like to?
I think he definitely changes over time. He changes what he's going for, what he wants to do over time. So it's almost as though he finds a way of representing. So, for example, boat building. at Flatford Mill. That was when he goes through this fairly short but really intense period of hyper-realism. You know, this is Constable setting up his easel at the scene and making a painting as close as he can to them, trying to get the sense of the weather and the light on canvas. But then, you know, the following year he gets married and then he leaves. So then things change and he's trying to do something slightly different. So the hay wain looks so different from boat building because it's much more about reflection and memory and emotion. And it's like the view of Suffolk from London is very different from the view of Suffolk when he's there. So that's just an example to say I think that that what he's trying to do keeps changing, and it's not that he's sort of dissatisfied, it's just that he's constantly looking for something slightly new to do because it sort of fits the case. He's no longer totally satisfied. He sees that maybe the skies aren't right. There's much more to learn about skies. Maybe the light isn't right. There's more I've got to learn about that. So it sort of grows in that way. He's very, you know, his intellect is always at work on it. Yeah, thank you.
And with that, I think let's say thank you once again.